You've made thousands of decisions in your life. What to believe, who to trust, what path to take. And most of those decisions felt completely logical at the time. Reasonable. Justified. But here's the part that's hard to sit with: the same mental process you use to make your best decisions is the exact same process you use to make your worst ones. You didn't feel the difference. It felt identical. So if you can't tell the difference between a good decision and a bad one while you're making it, how many times have you already been wrong, and still have no idea? And it's not just about one bad call. Most people are making decisions the same flawed way, every single day, without ever questioning it. We'll get into why your brain is quietly working against you in ways you'd never expect. Then we'll look at a set of questions, simple ones, that completely change how you process information before you act on it. We'll talk about what actually happens to your thinking when you're under pressure, because that's when it matters most. And toward the end, there's one idea in this book that most people never hear about, and once you do, the way you listen, argue, and decide will never feel the same again. If ideas like these are what you're looking for, the kind that actually change how you see things, make sure you're subscribed. There's a lot more where this came from. Here's something worth thinking about before anything else. When most people hear the words, critical thinking, they picture someone in a debate, picking apart every argument, finding flaws, pushing back on everything. Sharp. Aggressive. Always 2 steps ahead. And that image isn't completely wrong, but it's missing the most important part. Critical thinking isn't about attacking other people's ideas. It's about questioning your own. That shift sounds small. It isn't. Because the moment you turn that lens inward, you realize something uncomfortable: most of what you believe, you never actually chose to believe. It was handed to you. By your environment, your upbringing, the people around you, the information you happened to come across first. And because it arrived early, it felt like truth. Not opinion. Not assumption. Truth. Think about how you formed your opinion on something you feel strongly about right now. A belief about money, relationships, success, people. Now ask yourself, did you arrive at that belief by carefully examining the evidence? Or did you absorb it somewhere along the way and then spend years collecting reasons to confirm it? For most people, it's the second one. And the tricky part is, both paths feel exactly the same from the inside. This is where Cole draws a line that most people never think to draw. There's a difference between having thoughts and actually examining them. Your brain produces thoughts automatically, constantly, without asking for your input. That's just biology. But critical thinking is the deliberate act of stepping back and asking, is this actually true, or does it just feel true? And that gap, between what feels true and what is true, is where most bad decisions live. The reason this matters so much for beginners is that critical thinking is usually taught as a skill for arguing or analyzing other people's claims. Read this article and evaluate it. Listen to this argument and find the flaws. But Cole's approach starts somewhere more personal. It starts with the recognition that your own mind is the first place bias enters the picture. Before you ever evaluate anyone else's thinking, you're already filtering everything through a set of assumptions you didn't consciously build. There's a useful way to think about this. Imagine you're wearing tinted glasses. Everything you see is slightly colored by those lenses, but because you've worn them your whole life, you don't see the tint. You just see what you think is the world as it is. Critical thinking is the process of slowly becoming aware that you're wearing glasses at all. You can't take them off completely. Nobody can. But once you know they're there, you start to question what you're seeing in a way you never did before. That awareness is the foundation everything else in this book is built on. Not intelligence. Not education. Just the willingness to pause and ask, wait, why do I actually think this? And here's where it gets interesting. That pause, that small moment of genuine questioning, is something most people almost never do. Not because they're lazy or unintelligent, but because the brain is designed to be efficient. It doesn't want to re-examine things it's already filed away as settled. Every belief you've confirmed once gets easier to confirm again and harder to challenge. The brain rewards certainty and makes doubt feel uncomfortable. So most people avoid it without even realizing that's what they're doing. What Cole is really asking you to do is make doubt a habit. Not cynicism, that's different. Cynicism is just distrust wearing the mask of intelligence. Real doubt is curious. It asks questions not to tear things down but to get closer to what's actually true. And that distinction matters, because one closes your thinking and the other opens it. By the end of this book, critical thinking won't feel like an academic exercise. It'll feel like a habit you can't turn off, and that's exactly the point. So now that you understand what critical thinking actually is, here's the first real obstacle standing between you and it. And this one is sneaky, because it doesn't feel like an obstacle at all. It feels like common sense. Your brain takes shortcuts. It has to. Every single second, your mind is processing an enormous amount of information, sounds, emotions, memories, decisions, and it simply cannot analyze all of it from scratch every time. So it developed a system of mental shortcuts to speed things up. Quick patterns. Automatic conclusions. Instant judgments that feel completely reasonable in the moment. Those shortcuts are called cognitive biases. And they are running in the background of almost every decision you make. The word bias tends to make people defensive. It sounds like an accusation. But that's not what this is. Biases aren't character flaws. They're features of a brain that evolved to survive, not necessarily to think accurately. The problem is that the world you're trying to navigate now is a lot more complex than the environment those shortcuts were built for. And when you apply a survival shortcut to a modern decision, a career choice, a financial call, a relationship judgment, things go wrong in ways that are very hard to trace back to the source. Take confirmation bias. This is probably the most common one, and also the most invisible. Once you believe something, your brain automatically starts favoring information that supports that belief and quietly discounting anything that contradicts it. Not consciously. You're not sitting there deciding to ignore evidence. It just happens. The supportive information feels more credible, more interesting, more worth your attention. The contradicting information feels weak, biased, or irrelevant. And over time, the belief gets stronger, not because you found more proof, but because your brain filtered out everything that would have challenged it. Here's what makes this particularly difficult. The stronger the belief, the stronger the filter. So the things you're most certain about are often the things you've examined the least objectively. Certainty and accuracy are not the same thing, but the brain treats them as if they are. Then there's anchoring bias. This one is everywhere in daily life, and most people have no idea it's happening. Anchoring is when the first piece of information you receive about something becomes the reference point for everything that follows. A salary negotiation starts with a number someone throws out, and suddenly that number shapes the entire conversation even if it was completely arbitrary. A product is marked down from a high original price, and the discount feels like a deal even if the original price was inflated to begin with. A first impression of a person colors every interaction you have with them afterward, even when new information should have updated your view. The anchor doesn't have to be accurate or relevant to be powerful. It just has to arrive first. And then there's the availability heuristic. This one shapes how people assess risk and probability in ways that have real consequences. The basic idea is this: your brain judges how likely something is based on how easily an example comes to mind. If you can think of a vivid, recent, or emotionally charged example quickly, your brain concludes that thing must be common or likely. If examples are hard to recall, it concludes the thing must be rare. This is why people dramatically overestimate the danger of plane crashes and underestimate the danger of driving. Plane crashes are rare but memorable, they make headlines, they're vivid, they stick in the mind. Car accidents happen constantly but rarely get the same attention, so they don't feel as threatening. The actual statistics say the opposite, but the brain doesn't run on statistics. It runs on what's easy to remember. Now here's the part Cole really wants you to sit with. These 3 biases, and there are many more, aren't occasional glitches. They're the default setting. They're operating right now, in the background, shaping what you pay attention to, what you conclude, and what you decide to do next. The goal isn't to eliminate them. That's not possible. The goal is to know they exist so that when you catch yourself being absolutely certain about something, you can stop and ask, is this what the evidence actually shows, or is this just what my brain wants to believe? That question alone separates a critical thinker from everyone else in the room. So your brain has biases you didn't choose, running in the background of decisions you think are logical. That's an uncomfortable place to land. But here's where Cole shifts from diagnosis to something practical. Because awareness alone doesn't fix anything. Knowing you have blind spots doesn't automatically help you see around them. You need a process. Something repeatable. Something you can actually use in the middle of a real situation, not just in theory. That's what these 5 questions are. They're not complicated. They're not academic. They're the kind of questions that, once you start asking them consistently, make it almost impossible to think sloppily. And the interesting thing about them is that they don't require you to be smarter. They just require you to slow down at the right moment. The first question is, what am I actually assuming here? Every conclusion you reach is built on a foundation of assumptions. Most of the time those assumptions are invisible. You skip straight to the conclusion without ever examining what you had to believe first in order to get there. This question forces that examination. It pulls the foundation out into the open where you can actually look at it. And very often, when you see the assumption clearly, you realize it was never as solid as you thought. The second question is, what's the source of this information, and why should I trust it? This one sounds obvious, but people almost never actually ask it. Information arrives constantly, through news, social media, conversations, opinions dressed up as facts, and the brain tends to evaluate credibility based on confidence and familiarity rather than actual reliability. Someone who speaks with certainty feels more trustworthy than someone who hedges, even if the hedging is the more honest response. Asking where something comes from, and whether that source has a reason to be biased, changes how you receive it entirely. The third question is, what would change my mind? This is a deceptively powerful one. If you can't answer it, that's a problem. It means your belief isn't really open to evidence at all, it's just a position you're defending. A genuine belief, one that's actually tracking reality, should have conditions under which you'd revise it. If no evidence could ever change what you think, then what you have isn't a conclusion. It's a commitment. And commitments are immune to facts. The fourth question is, am I reacting or responding? There's a real difference between the two, and most people collapse them into the same thing. Reacting is automatic, it's the immediate emotional response, driven by whatever bias or past experience gets triggered first. Responding is deliberate, it's what happens when you pause long enough to actually process what's in front of you. The gap between those two things is where most of the damage happens in decisions made under pressure, in arguments that escalate unnecessarily, in judgments that turn out to be completely wrong. Just asking the question creates the pause. The fifth question is, what am I not seeing? This is the hardest one, because by definition you can't see what you're missing. But asking the question opens you up to looking. It makes you actively search for the angle you haven't considered, the perspective you haven't heard, the information that hasn't reached you yet. It's an admission that your current view is incomplete, and that admission, as uncomfortable as it feels, is one of the most intellectually honest things you can do. What makes these 5 questions powerful isn't any one of them individually. It's the habit of reaching for them before you land on a conclusion. Most people let conclusions arrive on their own, fast, automatic, confident. These questions interrupt that process just long enough for something more accurate to form instead. Cole makes a point here that's worth holding on to. He says the goal of critical thinking isn't to make decisions slower. It's to make them better. And most of the time, better decisions don't require more information. They require better questions asked of the information you already have. That reframe matters. Because most people assume that if they just had more data, more time, more expertise, they'd think more clearly. But you can have all of that and still ask terrible questions. And terrible questions always produce terrible answers, no matter how much information you feed into them. Start with the questions. Everything else follows. There's a specific kind of paralysis that happens when a problem gets big enough. You know the feeling. Something lands in front of you, a decision, a situation, a challenge with too many moving parts, and instead of thinking clearly, your mind just stalls. You go in circles. You start one train of thought and abandon it. You feel busy inside your head, but you're not actually getting anywhere. And the longer it goes on, the more overwhelming the whole thing becomes. Most people assume that feeling means the problem is too hard for them. It doesn't. It means they haven't broken it down yet. This is one of the most practical sections of Cole's book, and it's practical precisely because it's simple. Complex problems don't require complex solutions. They require a clear system for taking something large and making it small enough to actually work with. The first move is always the same: separate what you know from what you don't. This sounds obvious, but almost nobody does it deliberately. When a problem feels overwhelming, everything gets mixed together. Facts, assumptions, fears, possibilities, they all blur into one heavy mass, and that's exactly what makes it feel impossible. The moment you sit down and draw a hard line between what you actually know to be true and what you're guessing, inferring, or afraid of, the problem immediately gets smaller. Not because anything changed, but because you finally stopped treating uncertainty as if it were fact. The second move is to identify what the problem actually is. Not what it feels like. Not what it might lead to. What it actually is, right now. Because a huge portion of mental paralysis comes from solving the wrong problem. People spend enormous energy on a version of a situation that exists mainly in their imagination, the worst-case projection, the emotional narrative, the story built around what this problem means rather than what it actually is. Strip all of that away and very often the real problem is much more specific and manageable than the one you were suffering over. Once you know what the problem actually is, the next step is to break it into its smallest components. Not to solve them all at once, just to see them clearly as separate pieces. A complicated situation that feels like one giant wall usually turns out to be 4 or 5 smaller walls when you look at it closely. And smaller walls can be approached one at a time. That shift from one overwhelming thing to several manageable things changes everything about how your brain engages with it. Here's something Cole points out that most problem-solving frameworks miss. The sequence matters. Not all parts of a problem are equal, and not all of them need to be solved at the same time. Some pieces are load-bearing, solve those and other things fall into place. Some pieces are actually symptoms of a deeper issue, solve the surface one and the real problem remains. Learning to identify which parts of a problem are genuinely central and which are just noise is one of the most useful thinking skills you can develop. It's the difference between working hard on a problem and actually making progress on it. There's also the question of what you can control versus what you can't. This isn't just a mindset suggestion, it's a practical filter. When you're in the middle of a complex situation, a significant amount of the stress and confusion comes from trying to mentally manage things that are completely outside your influence. Identifying those clearly and deliberately setting them aside isn't giving up. It's focusing. The brain has limited processing capacity, and every ounce of it you spend on things you can't change is an ounce you're not spending on things you can. Cole's framework essentially asks you to do 4 things in sequence. Clarify what's real. Define what's actually broken. Isolate the pieces. Prioritize the ones that matter. None of those steps require exceptional intelligence. They require discipline, the discipline to slow down before you react, to separate signal from noise, and to resist the very human urge to treat a complicated feeling as if it were a complicated fact. The problems that feel the most overwhelming almost never are, once you actually look at them this way. What's overwhelming is usually the unexamined version, the one your brain handed you before you had a chance to question it. And that, by now, should sound very familiar. Everything we've covered so far assumes something that real life rarely gives you. Time. Space to think. The luxury of sitting down, asking the right questions, breaking things apart carefully, examining your assumptions without anything pushing back at you. But most of the decisions that actually matter don't arrive in calm conditions. They arrive when you're stressed, tired, emotionally activated, or when someone is waiting for an answer right now. And that's exactly when everything falls apart. There's a reason for this, and it's not weakness. When pressure enters the picture, your brain shifts modes. The analytical, deliberate thinking you've been building toward gets pushed to the back, and a faster, more reactive system takes over. It's the part of your brain that was designed to handle threats, quick, decisive, emotionally driven. In a genuine emergency, that's exactly what you need. But in a modern high-stakes situation, a difficult conversation, a financial decision, a moment where someone is pushing you for a commitment, that same system makes you impulsive in ways you'll regret later. The cruel irony is that pressure feels like clarity. When you're in it, fast decisions feel confident. Reactive responses feel justified. The emotional certainty that comes with a stress response is almost indistinguishable from the rational certainty that comes with actually thinking something through. Until afterward, when the pressure lifts and you look back and wonder what you were thinking. Cole identifies something here that's worth naming clearly. The problem with pressure isn't that it makes you stupid. It's that it makes you fast. And fast, in most situations that require real judgment, is the enemy of good. The goal isn't to slow everything down to a crawl, it's to create just enough of a gap between the moment pressure arrives and the moment you respond, so that your thinking has a chance to catch up with your emotions. That gap doesn't have to be long. It can be a breath. A pause. A single question inserted into the moment before you speak or decide. Something as simple as, is this actually urgent, or does it just feel urgent? Because those two things are very different, and pressure routinely convinces you they're the same. Most deadlines people feel in high-stakes moments aren't real. Someone wants an answer now not because the situation genuinely requires it, but because urgency is a tool. It compresses your thinking. It pushes you toward whatever option is most immediately available rather than whatever option is actually best. Recognizing that, feeling the pressure and still pausing to ask whether the urgency is real, is one of the most practically valuable things a critical thinker can do. There's another dimension to this that Cole spends time on. Under pressure, people default to what's familiar. Not what's right. Not what the evidence suggests. What feels safe and known. This is why people repeat the same mistakes in recurring high-pressure situations. The decision feels different each time because the details are different. But the underlying pattern, defaulting to the familiar response without examining it, is exactly the same. And it keeps producing the same results. Breaking that pattern requires something uncomfortable. It requires you to treat a high-pressure moment as a signal to slow down rather than speed up. Which is the opposite of what your brain is telling you to do. That conflict is real, and it doesn't disappear just because you understand it intellectually. But understanding it does give you something you didn't have before, the ability to recognize what's happening while it's happening, instead of only seeing it clearly in hindsight. That recognition is the whole game. You can't think perfectly under pressure. Nobody can. But you can learn to notice when pressure is doing your thinking for you. And that noticing, even a second before you respond, changes the quality of what comes next in ways that compound over time. The decisions you make under pressure reveal more about your thinking than any other kind. Not because pressure shows your true character, that's a cliché. But because pressure removes the conditions that normally support careful thought. What's left is the default. And the only way to change the default is to know what it is. At some point, almost every difficult conversation follows the same pattern. Two people with different views. Both convinced they're right. both waiting for the other person to finish talking so they can say what they already decided to say before the other person started. And by the end of it, nothing has moved. Nobody learned anything. The gap between them is exactly the same size it was at the beginning, maybe wider. Most people walk away from those conversations thinking the other person was unreasonable. But the method was the problem, not the person. This is where Cole introduces something that sounds academic but is genuinely one of the most useful communication tools you can develop. The Socratic Method. Named after the Greek philosopher Socrates, who never actually lectured anyone on what to think. Instead, he asked questions. Carefully, deliberately, one at a time, until the person he was talking to arrived at the answer themselves. That distinction is everything. When you tell someone they're wrong, something predictable happens. Their defenses go up. The conversation stops being about the idea and starts being about ego. They're no longer thinking about whether you might be right, they're thinking about how to protect their position. And the harder you push, the harder they hold. You've probably felt this from both sides. But when you ask someone a genuine question about their position, not a loaded question designed to trap them, a real one, something different happens. They have to think. They have to examine what they actually believe and why. And sometimes, in the process of articulating it out loud, they hear something in their own answer that doesn't quite hold up. Not because you told them it didn't. Because they found it themselves. That's the Socratic Method working. And it works because people trust their own conclusions far more than they trust yours. Cole is clear about something here that's easy to miss. This isn't a manipulation technique. It's not a way to trick people into agreeing with you by asking clever questions. The method only works when your questions are genuinely curious, when you're actually trying to understand the other person's thinking, not just dismantle it. The moment it becomes a trap, the other person feels it. And the moment they feel it, you've lost them completely. The practical version of this looks like slowing down in a disagreement and asking things like, what makes you see it that way? What would need to be true for this to work? Have you considered what happens if this assumption turns out to be wrong? These aren't aggressive questions. They don't attack the position. They invite the person to look at their own thinking from a slight distance, which is exactly what's needed for any real shift to happen. And here's the part that makes this genuinely difficult to practice. The Socratic Method requires you to be comfortable not winning in the traditional sense. You don't get to deliver the sharp takedown. You don't get the moment where you lay out your argument and watch the other person have no response. The conversation moves slowly. It meanders. Sometimes it ends without a clear resolution. And for people who are used to measuring a conversation's success by whether they came out ahead, that feels deeply unsatisfying. But the outcomes are completely different. Conversations that end with someone genuinely reconsidering their position, even slightly, are worth 10 times the conversations that end with someone publicly defeated and privately more convinced than ever. Pressure produces resistance. Questions produce reflection. And reflection is the only thing that actually changes minds. Cole also makes the point that the Socratic Method sharpens your own thinking just as much as it challenges someone else's. When you commit to asking real questions instead of making statements, you realize quickly how many of your own positions can't survive the same scrutiny. That discomfort is valuable. It means you're thinking, not just defending. The goal of every difficult conversation, if you're doing it right, isn't to win. It's to get closer to the truth. Sometimes that means the other person moves. Sometimes it means you do. And sometimes it means you both walk away with something you didn't have before, a clearer picture of a complicated thing. That outcome is only possible when someone in the room decides to ask instead of tell. Here's something nobody tells you about developing a skill like critical thinking. The work doesn't end. There's no point where you arrive, look around, and decide you figured it out. In fact, the moment you start feeling like you have it figured out is usually the moment you've stopped growing without noticing. This isn't discouraging. It's just the nature of any skill that operates in a changing world. Cole spends time in this section on something that gets overlooked in most books about thinking, the maintenance problem. Most people treat mental skills the way they treat a qualification. You study, you learn, you earn it, and then it's yours. But thinking doesn't work that way. The quality of your thinking is directly tied to the quality of what you're feeding your mind, the diversity of perspectives you're exposing yourself to, and your willingness to keep being uncomfortable. Let any of those things stagnate and your thinking stagnates with them. Mental resilience is the foundation that makes all of this sustainable. And Cole is careful to define it in a way that separates it from the generic toughness advice you hear everywhere. Resilience here doesn't mean pushing through pain or refusing to quit. It means the ability to encounter an idea that challenges what you believe and stay in that discomfort long enough to actually examine it, instead of immediately reaching for a reason to dismiss it. That's harder than it sounds. Because the brain's default response to a threatening idea isn't curiosity. It's rejection. The more central a belief is to your identity, the faster and stronger that rejection comes. You don't experience it as defensiveness. You experience it as clarity, a sudden, confident sense that the challenging idea is simply wrong. The feeling is almost indistinguishable from genuine insight. But one of them is protecting your ego and the other is tracking reality. Resilient thinkers learn to sit with that feeling without immediately acting on it. They've practiced the pause long enough that when something challenges them, the first response isn't rejection or acceptance, it's inquiry. What is this actually saying? Is there something here worth examining? Could this be right in a way I haven't considered yet? That practice is what Cole calls the growth loop. And it has a few specific components that are worth understanding clearly. The first is seeking feedback actively, not just receiving it passively. Most people tolerate feedback when it arrives. Resilient thinkers go looking for it, specifically from people who see things differently than they do. Not to be proven wrong for the sake of it, but because the gaps in your thinking are almost always invisible from inside your own perspective. Someone outside it can see what you can't. That input is genuinely valuable, and treating it as a threat rather than a resource is one of the most expensive thinking habits you can have. The second component is reflective practice. Cole talks about the habit of regularly revisiting your own decisions and conclusions, not to punish yourself for mistakes, but to understand what produced them. Most people do a version of this only when something goes badly wrong. But the most useful learning happens when you examine ordinary decisions too. The ones that worked out fine. The ones you made quickly and never questioned. Because sometimes those are the ones built on the shakiest foundations, and you just got lucky with the outcome. The third component is deliberately expanding your inputs. The thinking you do is only as good as the raw material going into it. If you're only reading things you agree with, only talking to people who share your worldview, only consuming content that confirms what you already believe, your thinking will circle the same territory indefinitely. Cole is direct about this. Intellectual comfort is the enemy of intellectual growth. The ideas that make you uncomfortable are frequently the ones that have the most to teach you, precisely because they're coming from outside the boundaries of what you've already mapped. And underneath all of this is one consistent theme. Curiosity. Not as a personality trait you either have or don't have, but as a practice. A deliberate choice, made repeatedly, to keep asking questions even when you already have an answer. Especially when you already have an answer. Because the most dangerous place for a thinker to be isn't confusion. It's certainty. If you've made it this far, you're already ahead of most people. Everything covered before this, the biases, the questions, the frameworks, the resilience, all of it makes you a sharper, more careful thinker. But there's one idea left. And it's the one that separates people who think well from people who think exceptionally. Most people never hear about it. And the ones who do often resist it immediately, because on the surface it sounds like the opposite of what you'd want to do. It's called Steelmaning. Here's what it is. Instead of taking the weakest version of someone's argument and tearing it apart, which is easy, and satisfying, and almost completely useless, you take the strongest possible version of their argument. The most intelligent, most charitable, most well-constructed version. You build it up as powerfully as you can. And then you engage with that. The opposite of this has a name too. It's called a straw man. You've seen it everywhere, in political debates, in online arguments, in everyday disagreements. Someone takes a position, and instead of addressing what the person actually said, their opponent attacks a simplified, exaggerated, easier-to-defeat version of it. It feels like a win. It looks like a win. But nothing was actually resolved, because the real argument was never touched. Steelmaning refuses to do that. It demands that you engage with the actual idea at its actual strongest. And that's where it gets uncomfortable. Because to steelman something, you have to genuinely understand it. You have to think from inside a perspective you might disagree with, find its strongest logic, articulate it clearly, sometimes more clearly than the person who originally made the argument. That process requires you to set your own position aside temporarily. Not abandon it. Just set it aside long enough to give the other view a real and honest hearing. Most people can't do this. Not because they're not intelligent enough, but because they've never tried. We're trained from early on to defend our positions, not to strengthen the oppositions. The idea of making the other side's argument better than they made it themselves feels almost counterproductive. Why would you do that? Here's why. When you steelman an argument and still find it wanting, your rebuttal becomes unassailable. You can't be accused of misrepresenting the position. You can't be dismissed for attacking something nobody actually said. You engaged with the strongest version and still found the flaws. That's a completely different level of credibility than winning against a weakened opponent. But more importantly, and this is the part that changes things, sometimes when you steelman a position you disagree with, you realize it's actually stronger than you thought. Sometimes you find yourself unable to defeat it as cleanly as you expected. And that discomfort, that moment of genuine uncertainty about your own position, is one of the most valuable experiences a thinker can have. It means you found something real. Something that deserves more examination. Something that might actually shift what you believe. Cole's point is simple but profound. The quality of your thinking is determined not by how well you defend your own positions, but by how honestly you engage with the ones that challenge them. Anyone can win an argument against a weak opponent. Critical thinkers seek out the strongest version of every opposing view, because that's the only place real understanding lives. Think about the last time you changed your mind about something important. Really changed it, not just updated a small detail, but genuinely shifted a core belief. It almost certainly happened because you encountered an idea that was too strong to dismiss. Too well-reasoned. Too honest. Something you couldn't steelman your way past. And that encounter, uncomfortable as it was, moved you forward in a way that 100 easy victories never could. That's what this skill produces. Not just better arguments. Better thinking. And eventually, better decisions, better relationships, and a clearer picture of a world that most people are content to see through the tint of whatever glasses they happen to be handed. You don't have to agree with everyone. You just have to understand them well enough to know exactly why you don't. What this book is really asking you to do is simple, even if it isn't easy. Start with yourself. Not with other people's arguments, not with the news, not with everything wrong in the world around you, with the way your own mind works when nobody is watching. The biases running quietly in the background. The assumptions you never chose but carry everywhere. The decisions that felt logical until they didn't. From there, the questions. Not answers, questions. Asked before conclusions, not after. Asked honestly, with genuine willingness to hear something you weren't expecting. Then the pressure moments. The situations where everything you've built gets tested by speed and emotion and the very human urge to just decide and move on. That's where the real practice happens. Not in calm reflection, but in the middle of something that's pushing back. And underneath all of it, the resilience to keep going. To stay curious past the point where certainty feels more comfortable. To steelman the idea that unsettles you most, because that's where the most honest thinking lives. Here's the one thing worth trying today. Find one belief you hold with complete confidence, something you've never seriously questioned, and spend 10 minutes asking what would have to be true for it to be wrong. Not to abandon it. Just to look at it clearly, maybe for the first time. That's where it starts. The ideas in this book only take you so far. Because thinking critically is one layer, but thinking strategically is the one that actually moves you forward. There's a book that picks up exactly where this one leaves off. It's called The Art of Strategic Thinking by Caspian Lux. And if critical thinking is about seeing clearly, strategic thinking is about knowing what to do with what you see. How to read a situation before anyone else does. How to position yourself without announcing it. How to win in ways most people never even notice happening. If that's the direction you want to go next, that video is already waiting for you. And if the ideas from today are the kind that actually make you think, you know what to do.